Democratic socialism, a political tradition embraced by the radical left and feared by the right, continues to have a moment in American politics. Let's have a listen.
When people say democratic socialist, right? And I'm curious what you think this means. I mean, do you like capitalism?
No, I have many critiques of capitalism. And I think ultimately the definition for me of why I call myself a democratic socialist is the words of Dr. King decades ago. He said, call it democracy or call it democratic socialism. There must be a better distribution of wealth for all of God's children in this country. And that's what I'm focused on, is dignity and taking on income inequality. And for too long, politicians have pretended that we're spectators to that crisis of affordability. We're actually actors, and we have the choice to exacerbate it, like Mayor Adams has done, or to respond to it and resolve it, like I'm planning to do.
Okay.
You have said you are a democratic socialist. Can you be a democratic socialist and a capitalist?
Well, I think it depends on your interpretation. So there are some democratic socialists that would say absolutely not. There are other people that are democratic socialists that would say, I think it's possible.
What are you?
I think it's possible. I think. Do
you say to yourself, I'm a capitalist, but?
I don't say that.
Okay.
You know, if anything, I would say I believe in a democratic economy, but.
Now, depending on who you ask, democratic socialism is either the liberator of democracy or the end of it. But what exactly is it? And what meaning does it take on in contemporary politics? Hopefully this video will answer those questions, but before we get into it, my name is Rendani Tshitangano, and I'm excited to have you on. In 1944, Austrian economist Friedrich von Hayek published a book titled The Road to Serfdom, which essentially was a warning against what he saw as the creeping dangers of central economic planning, even in democratic contexts. Now, von Hayek wasn't just warning against Stalinist communism, or the kind that would be deemed revolutionary. He was deeply concerned with the rise of democratic socialism in Western Europe, especially in Britain and in Germany, where moderate socialists believed that equality and justice could be achieved by giving the state control over the economy. In these early visions of democratic socialism, the state wouldn't just regulate capitalism. It would replace market forces with collective planning, aiming to allocate resources fairly and eliminate inequality at its roots. To Hayek, who was a staunch capitalist, this was a grave mistake. He argued that even when done in the name of democracy and equality, that central economic planning required coercion. Because no group of planners could ever fully predict or organize the complexity of human life, we all know how the argument goes. And the more power given to the planners, Hayek argued, the more liberty the individuals lose. What Hayek was responding to in the 1940s was not just a theory. It was a political project taking shape in Europe. Democratic socialist parties like the British Labour Party and the German SPD weren't simply calling for better working conditions or expanded welfare. They were advocating for public ownership and government planning of key industries such as coal, railways, and steel, aiming to ensure these sectors served the public good. This vision of socialism had deep roots in evolutionary socialism, a theory advanced by Edward Bernstein at the turn of the 20th century. Now, Bernstein, who was originally a follower of Marx, broke from traditional Marxist thought by arguing that socialism didn't require violent revolution or the collapse of capitalism. Instead, he believed that socialism could be achieved through gradual democratic reforms within the existing political and economic systems. He argued that capitalism was adapting, not collapsing, and that workers' conditions were improving through unions, strikes, and political engagement. Crucially, Bernstein believed that markets would remain a permanent feature of the economy. They would not be abolished as Marx had predicted. And instead, he proposed that the state regulate these markets and key industries to ensure fairness, reduce inequality, and protect workers. Markets and private property could still exist, but they would operate within a reformed socialist framework, where the state would intervene to ensure that economic life served the public good rather than just private profit. Of course, this was not the only vision of democratic socialism. Thinkers like Rosa Luxemburg rejected Bernstein's approach, insisting that capitalism must eventually be abolished, not just regulated. That's the interpretation I align with. One where socialism is not merely a fairer capitalism, but a fundamentally different economic order. Yet it was precisely the spectrum of ideas from regulation to transformation that Hayek warned against in The Road to Serfdom. Today, when politicians like Bernie Sanders, Zoran Mamdani, or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez call themselves democratic socialists, they are usually advocating for universal health care, student debt relief, and a stronger social safety net, all within a largely market-based economy. So the question becomes, if there's no broad central economic planning or abolition of capitalism, is it really socialism? Or is it social democracy dressed in socialist language? In many ways, what Edward Bernstein envisioned is exactly what many modern-day democratic socialists, like figures previously mentioned, are calling for. But here's the problem. That vision is no longer socialism in the traditional sense. It's a form of ethical capitalism, if you will, or what many in Europe would simply call social democracy. We've traced the path of democratic socialism from its early 20th century commitment to central economic planning, to Bernstein's revisionist vision of gradual reform, to today's progressive politics, where the label democratic socialism is often attached to policies like Medicare for all or free college tuition. Hayek warned that utopias don't always come wrapped in tyranny. Sometimes they arrive cloaked in democracy and good intentions, and Bernstein, though much moderate, also understood that the danger lies in being unclear about our goals. I believe that many modern-day democratic socialists aren't actually advocating socialism, not in the traditional systemic sense. They are advocating for social democracy, a fairer capitalism, a stronger state, and a society that cares for the vulnerable. Now, don't get me wrong, these are noble goals, but let's name them for what they are. Language shapes politics, and when we blur the lines between systems, calling ethical capitalism socialism or calling reform revolution, we lose the clarity we need to build meaningful alternatives. But why does this mislabeling persist? Why are so many left-leaning figures hesitant to go further, to call for the actual dismantling of capitalism, rather than just softening its edges? I'd argue this. The reluctance of leftist Democrats to fully embrace Marxist communism, or even a democratic socialism that sees capitalism as a system to be ended, not mended, lies in something deeper. In America, communism isn't just a political tradition. It's an enemy. For decades, the US government and media have positioned communism as the antithesis of American identity. Unpatriotic, authoritarian, dangerous. To embrace it, even in its democratic or humanist form, is to risk being cast as fundamentally un-American. So instead, democratic socialism in the US becomes a kind of branding exercise, a strategic appeal to a working class frustration without crossing the ideological line. It says we're not trying to overthrow capitalism. We just want a better version of it. That's the hook. That's the comfort. But is that really socialism? Or is it a capitalism with a conscience? So whether you're on the left, right, or somewhere in between, the real task is not to soften or sanitize ideas, but to be honest about what they are. Thanks for watching. My name is Rendani Tshitangano, and I hope you enjoyed this video.